He played the chords that carried some of rock's most legendary voices. But behind the music, Bobby Whitlock's own story was as raw and unforgettable as the songs he helped create. On stage, Whitlock was a force, his voice soulful, his keyboard playing rich with gospel fire, his presence magnetic. As a founding member of Derek and the Dominoes alongside Eric Clapton, he was part of one of the most celebrated albums in rock history, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs. His harmonies and Hammond organ swells were woven into the very fabric of tracks that have defined generations. But his life in music was far more than a single masterpiece. It was a journey through the heart of rock and soul. Whitlock's path began in the American South, where gospel music and rhythm and blues shaped his earliest memories. By the late 1960s, he had already made his mark as a session musician with Stax Records, playing alongside icons like Booker T. Jones and Sam and Dave. His talents eventually brought him across the Atlantic to London, where a chance alignment of musicians would birth Derek and the Dominoes, a group whose brief existence left a lasting legacy. Yet for all the triumph, there were shadows. Whitlock's years in the music industry were marked by the turbulence that often accompanied the era. Creative clashes, personal struggles, and the heavy toll of a rock and roll lifestyle lived without breaks. He stepped away from the spotlight for long stretches, preferring the quiet of rural life to the chaos of fame. In later years, Whitlock returned to music on his own terms, performing with his wife Coco Carmel and reconnecting with fans who had never forgotten the warmth and grit of his voice. His story became one of survival and resilience, of a man who had lived through the highs and lows of the rock era and still found joy in the simple act of making music. Now, as the world reflects on Bobby Whitlock's life and work, it is clear that his contributions went far beyond the hits. He was a bridge between genres, a collaborator whose touch elevated every project he joined, and a living link to an era when rock and soul were inseparable. The question that remains is not just how we remember his music, but how we remember the man behind it, the one whose notes carried both the triumphs and the scars of a life fully lived. To understand Bobby Whitlock's journey, you have to picture the American South in the 1950s and 1960s, where gospel choirs shook church walls on Sunday mornings and blues drifted through the air on Saturday nights. Born in Memphis, Tennessee, Whitlock was surrounded by music from the very beginning. Memphis was a crossroads of sound, home to Beale Street blues, the raw edge of rock and roll, and the deep soul grooves of Stax Records. Whitlock's early years were steeped in this cultural blend. He absorbed gospel's emotional intensity, rhythm and blues groove, and country's storytelling tradition. This mixture would become the foundation of his style, a sound rooted in soul but versatile enough to live in rock, blues, and even folk. He began playing piano and organ at a young age, guided by the instinct that music was not just a pastime, but a calling. The late 1960s were a golden age for Memphis music, and Stax Records was at its heart. Whitlock became the first white artist signed to the label, a bold move in an era when the music industry was still rigidly divided by race. At Stax, he honed his craft alongside legends like Booker T and the MGs, Isaac Hayes and Sam and Dave. The label's house style, tight, soulful, and unpretentious, shaped Whitlock's approach to both playing and songwriting. But Memphis was only the beginning. In 1969, Whitlock's path took him to London, where the British blues explosion was in full swing. Introduced to Eric Clapton through mutual friends, Whitlock found himself in the orbit of rock royalty. It was a period of intense creativity and collaboration, as musicians from both sides of the Atlantic merged their influences into something new. Derek and the Dominoes emerged from this environment, a supergroup that burned brightly and briefly. With Clapton, Carl Rattle, and Jim Gordon, Whitlock helped create Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs, an album that would become a cornerstone of rock history. His harmonies on Layla, his lead vocal on Thorn Tree in the Garden, and his organ work throughout the record gave it a depth and soul that set it apart from other guitar-driven rock albums of the era. The theme that runs through Whitlock's career is collaboration, his ability to bring warmth, emotional depth, and structure to the work of others without losing his own voice. He was not a frontman in the traditional sense during his peak years, but his presence was essential. Whether in the studio with Clapton, George Harrison, or Delaney and Bonnie, Whitlock's touch could turn a good song into something timeless. Yet for all his contributions, Whitlock's life was never just about the music. It was about the people, the moments of shared creation, and the fleeting magic of a band in perfect sync. It was also about navigating the personal and professional storms that come when talent, ego, and ambition collide. In this world of constant change, Whitlock learned to adapt, to shift from being a sideman to a solo artist, from the chaos of the touring life to the peace of playing for smaller, more intimate audiences. Through it all, the core of his artistry remained the same: soulful honesty and a deep love for the craft. Bobby Whitlock's rise began quietly, without the kind of explosive breakthrough that usually makes headlines. Instead, it was built on a series of steady, pivotal moments, each one bringing him closer to the heart of rock history. In Memphis, his early days at Stax Records shaped not only his musical skills, but his understanding of how songs are built. Working alongside Booker T. Jones, Steve Cropper, and Duck Dunn, he learned the art of groove, how to make a rhythm section breathe, and how to let a song's emotional core shine without overplaying. These lessons would stay with him forever. His time with Delaney and Bonnie and friends in the late 1960s became the bridge between the soul world of Memphis and the rock elite of London. The group's blend of gospel-infused rock caught the attention of Eric Clapton, George Harrison, and a host of other stars. Whitlock was not just a keyboard player in the band, he was a singer, songwriter, and arranger who helped shape their warm, communal sound. When Clapton decided to form Derek and the Dominoes, Whitlock was one of the first people he called. Together with bassist Carl Rattle and drummer Jim Gordon, they began writing and rehearsing in Clapton's home, forging the sound that would define Layla and other assorted love songs. Whitlock co-wrote several tracks, including Any Day, Tell the Truth, and Why Does Love Got to Be So Sad? His harmonies on Bell Bottom Blues and his heartfelt delivery of Thorn Tree in the Garden became emotional pillars of the album. The sessions for Layla were intense and fueled by a mixture of creative energy and personal turmoil. Clapton's unrequited love for Pattie Boyd, the arrival of Duane Allman with his soaring slide guitar, and the combustible personalities of the band created an atmosphere where every take felt urgent and alive. Whitlock's gospel-rooted playing on the Hammond organ brought warmth and gravity to the mix, anchoring Allman's flights of improvisation and Clapton's searing solos. But as quickly as Derek and the Dominoes rose, they fell apart. Personal conflicts, substance abuse, and the pressures of sudden fame tore at the fabric of the group. By 1971, the band was finished, leaving behind only the Layla album and a handful of live recordings. Whitlock then embarked on a solo career, releasing albums like Bobby Whitlock, 1972, and Raw Velvet, 1972, which showcased his songwriting and soulful vocals. Critics praised his work, but without the machinery of a major band behind him, commercial success proved elusive. Still, he remained a respected figure among musicians, often contributing to projects for friends and collaborators. The 1980s and 1990s were quieter years for Whitlock. He stepped away from the industry's front lines, preferring a more private life. Yet he never abandoned music. In small studios and living rooms, he continued to write, record, and occasionally perform. His return to the stage in the 2000s, often alongside his wife Coco Carmel, brought him back into the public eye, this time on his own terms. For Whitlock, the rise was never about chasing stardom. It was about building a life around music, connecting with others through shared creativity, and leaving a legacy of authenticity. His journey was proof that influence is not always measured in chart positions or ticket sales. It can live in the spaces between the notes, in the way a song makes someone feel decades after it was recorded. Bobby Whitlock's story, like so many from the golden age of rock, carried a shadow that ran parallel to the music. The glory of playing with legends, of being part of Layla and other assorted love songs, was matched by the chaos that came with it. The world saw him as a gifted keyboardist and soulful singer, standing beside Eric Clapton and Duane Allman. But off-stage, life was far less harmonious. The sessions that produced Layla were electrifying musically, but personally, they were steeped in exhaustion, love triangles, heavy drinking, and a growing dependence on drugs that plagued much of the rock world at the time. Whitlock, like many of his peers, found himself swept into a lifestyle that offered little stability. When Derek and the Dominoes fell apart, it was sudden and absolute. One moment they were on the cusp of global superstardom, the next they were gone, leaving Whitlock to face a brutal truth. His musical home had been dismantled, and the camaraderie that had fueled his creative spirit had dissolved into silence. That silence was deafening. His solo career in the early 1970s, though critically praised, struggled commercially. Without the full weight of the industry behind him, and still reeling from the Dominoes' collapse, Whitlock fought to find his footing. He continued to record, but the emotional toll of watching his bandmates spiral into addiction, and in some cases tragedy, left deep scars. The death of Duane Allman in 1971 was a blow that shook him to his core. Whitlock withdrew from the public eye for long stretches. He later spoke about how disillusionment with the music industry, coupled with the personal chaos of his younger years, led him to step away. His move into a quieter life was as much about survival as it was about peace. He traded the glare of stage lights for the quiet of rural living, where music became a personal refuge rather than a public performance. In interviews later in life, Whitlock reflected on those years with a mix of pride and regret. He was proud of the music, of the friendships, and of having stood at the center of one of rock's greatest moments. But he also acknowledged the self-destructive patterns and the emotional cost of chasing perfection in a world that chewed up its brightest talents. His return to performing in the 2000s with Coco Carmel was, in many ways, a redemption. He played smaller venues, engaged directly with fans, and found joy in music again, without the pressures that had once consumed him. But even then, he carried the weight of memory, the bittersweet knowledge that the peak of his fame had been both a blessing and a wound. When news of his passing spread, the tribute spoke not only of his musical contributions, but of his resilience. Fellow musicians remembered his generosity, his laugh, and his unshakable sense of authenticity. Fans wrote about how his songs had been the soundtrack to their lives, how his voice could still stir something deep inside them decades later. The dark truth of Bobby Whitlock's life was that the very environment that elevated him was the same one that nearly destroyed him. And yet, he endured. He chose, in the end, to live for the music rather than for the machine behind it. That choice, perhaps more than any note he ever played, defined the man he became. At Legends and Secrets, we have shared the stories of artists who shaped music history. But Bobby Whitlock's story is unique because it reminds us how deeply collaboration can define a legacy. His career was not simply about being a sideman to bigger names. It was about being an essential ingredient in moments of pure musical magic. Whitlock's contributions to Layla and other assorted love songs cannot be overstated. His gospel-rooted vocals, rich Hammond organ textures, and co-writing on some of the album's most enduring tracks helped make it one of the most beloved records in rock history. While Eric Clapton's guitar work and Duane Allman's slide solos often received the spotlight, Whitlock's touch gave the music its emotional core. Without him, the album's balance of raw power and heartfelt vulnerability would not have been the same. We believe his greatest gift was the ability to enhance the talents of those around him without ever losing his own voice. In the Dominoes with George Harrison, with Delaney and Bonnie, Whitlock was never content to be just background. He added a layer of soul and authenticity that turned good songs into timeless ones. That is a rare quality, and it is why fellow musicians valued his presence so highly. His story also reflects the harsh reality of the music industry. The same world that elevated him to the center of legendary sessions offered little support when the spotlight shifted. Whitlock's years away from the stage speak to the toll fame and industry politics can take on an artist's spirit. And yet, rather than becoming bitter, he chose a path of quiet resilience, returning to music on his own terms. In his later performances with Coco Carmel, we saw a different side of Whitlock, more grounded, more at peace, and perhaps more connected to his audience than ever before. The large arenas of his youth were replaced by intimate rooms, but the music was no less powerful. If anything, it felt more personal, as if he were finally sharing his songs without the weight of expectation. For us, Bobby Whitlock's legacy is not just in the music he made, but in the example he set for surviving the industry's highs and lows with dignity. His work is a reminder that collaboration is an art in itself, and that the truest measure of an artist is not just in their fame, but in the depth of what they bring to the music and to the people around them. Now we ask you, when you think of Bobby Whitlock, what comes to mind? Is it the harmonies on Layla, the organ that swells like a heartbeat in the background? Is it the soulful voice that could shift from tender to roaring in a single line? Or is it the story of a man who walked away from the chaos only to return when the music called him back? Some musicians are remembered for their fame. Others are remembered for their craft. Bobby Whitlock belongs to the latter, and that is what makes his story endure. He was never chasing the brightest spotlight, yet he stood in the center of one of rock's defining moments. His voice, his playing, and his songwriting were woven into music that still moves people half a century later. The fact that his name is not as widely known as the records he helped create only makes his work feel more like a hidden treasure, one you discover and feel lucky to know. For fans who grew up with Layla and other assorted love songs, hearing Whitlock's voice is like stepping back into a time when rock, blues, and soul collided in the most human way. For those who discovered him later, his later performances with Coco Caramel showed that the spark was still there, matured, perhaps mellowed, but no less authentic. Whitlock's journey is a reminder that music is not just about fame or charts, it is about connection. The organ swell that lifts a chorus, the harmony that makes a lyric hit harder, the quiet presence in a band that allows everything to fall into place. These are the invisible threads that hold great songs together, and Bobby Whitlock was a master at weaving them. Some stories are never told, but now you know. The memory of Bobby Whitlock is not just in the notes he played, but in the spaces between them, in the unspoken trust between bandmates, in the long nights in the studio when music was all that mattered, in the resilience it takes to step away from the machine and come back with your soul intact. This was Bobby Whitlock, and though the final chord has faded, the music he gave us still hums quietly in the background, waiting for anyone who needs to be reminded of what rock and soul can do when they meet in the hands of someone who truly understands.